Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Max Scheler begins his study Ressentiment by telling us that among the scanty discoveries which have been made in recent time about the origin of moral judgments, Friedrich Nietzsche's discovery that ressentiment can be the source of such value judgments is the most profound. He's going to criticize Nietzsche, and we'll look at this elsewhere, for getting Christian morality wrong and targeting that. But he says that this is quite true, even if that specific characterization is wrong. And he's going to bring up three passages to start with, all of which are from the Genealogy of Morals, all of which are from the first treatise. And I will point out that ressentiment is discussed in other Nietzsche's works and also in other portions of the genealogy, specifically in the third treatise. So I'm only going to read one of these because the other two are not quite as germane, and then we'll launch right into discussing how he starts his inquiry. So he says, this is coming from Nietzsche, the slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and produces values. The ressentiment of beings to whom the real reaction, that of the deed, is denied, who can only indulge in imaginary revenge. Whereas every noble morality springs from a triumphant acceptance and affirmation of oneself, slave morality is in its very essence a negation of everything outside and different, of whatever is not oneself, and this negation is its creative deed. This reversal of the perspective of valuation, this necessary determination by the outside rather than by oneself, is typical of ressentiment. In order to arise, slave morality always needs a hostile external world. Physiologically speaking, it needs external stimuli in order to act at all. Its action is fundamentally a reaction. And so this is coming from section 10 of the first treatise of the Genealogy of Morals. And Scheler is going to say, okay, this tells us some things about what Nietzsche and what Scheler thinks is a great term are calling ressentiment. And so he says, instead of defining the word, and very often in philosophy, we don't begin by defining. A lot of people want that sort of thing. Scheler is a phenomenologist and also a sociologist. He thinks that it's better to provide descriptions, characterizations, to dig into the phenomena. If you're going to have a definition, it's going to happen at the end of your analysis, not the very beginning of it. So he says, let's characterize or describe this phenomenon. And that's really what he's going to be doing throughout this first part of the work. So he does have a nice characterization here. He says ressentiment is a self-poisoning of the mind or the spirit, the Geist, which has quite definite causes and consequences. So we can look at it through what the sources or causes of ressentiment are. As it's going to turn out, it's a little bit complicated, and makes sense because it's a complicated human behavior, a complicated human motivation. But let's start with this, self-poisoning, right? So it represents something that's off, something that takes the human organism and screws it up, but not the body so much, although we could say there could be things in the body reflective of this, but particularly the mind, or to use another term that Scheler will often invoke, the heart. It's going to have to do with our loves and hates, our desires and aversions, our values. And it has definite causes. We can figure out where it comes from and consequences. So what can we say about this? What are the causes? It's not just any old emotion whatsoever. He says it's a lasting mental attitude, so it perdures over time, caused by the systematic repression or suppression, those are two terms that are going to get used a lot here, of certain emotions and affects, which as such are normal components of human nature. So it's not the repression or suppression of things that are weird, wacky, total outliers. These are emotions that we human beings throughout all history, probably so long as there are human beings in existence, felt, feel, will feel. They're common to us. They're things that arise quite naturally for us. And so why are these going to be repressed? Well, we'll look at that in just a moment. Now, what is the result? What is the consequence of this? Their repression leads to a constant tendency to indulge in certain kinds of what here Scheler is using a term, value delusions. So being mistaken in a systematic way, often unconscious way, about values, about what actually has certain values. And we should remark here that Scheler is somebody who is committed to there being an entire hierarchy of values, some higher, some lower. So, for example, utility, pleasure, these are kind of lower values. The vital values are, which include nobility and things like that, are higher. And then we have spiritual values all the way up to the holy. And you don't necessarily have to buy into Scheler's particular hierarchy in order to see how this works. But ressentiment makes people get mixed up about what actually has what value, what should be prioritized or preferred to what else, and to make corresponding value judgments. We're constantly making judgments of value. This is good, this is bad. This is noble, this is base, or beautiful and ugly. This is right, this is wrong. This is useful, this is harmful, right? These are all value judgments. This goes all the way back to ancient philosophy. We see that Plato and Aristotle talk about and identify these opposed values. The Stoics do as well. This is a constant in moral philosophy. So getting values and judgments wrong is going to be a problem. That's why we want to understand ressentiment. What does it have to do with? So he labels a number of emotions that are particularly involved in this. He gives you a listing here, which doesn't actually encompass every single one that he talks about, but it encompasses a lot. He says the emotions and affects primarily concerned are revenge, hatred, malice, envy, the impulse to detract, that is to put down, to try to pull things down from the high to low, to complain, and spite. Now, some people might be a little bit confused about, where do these begin, where do these end, and we can get into that. Suffice it to say, these are all negative emotions, right? And these are all things that we often feel, they're normal, but we also feel bad about feeling. We're like, oh, it's not good. We don't typically celebrate these too much. And he's going to talk about each of these in turn in different ways. And, where he says that, one of the first sources of ressentiment is thirst for revenge, desire for revenge, or retaliation, right? He says that this has to be distinguished from other impulses for reprisals or self-defense, even when this reaction is accompanied by anger, fury, or indignation. So we're seeing he's making a lot of useful distinctions. And he talks about this reactive impulse, right? And it has to be checked and put off till a later time. We take revenge precisely because we couldn't retaliate immediately. We couldn't get to them and do something. Now, the desire for revenge is an affect that has a definite object. I want to take revenge against that SOB over there who did this thing to me. And we can say that about other feelings as well. And he is going to say that we have a progression of feeling which can start with revenge and then run via rancor, envy, and impulse to detract, all the way to spite, coming close to ressentiment. But usually revenge and envy, which he's going to treat here as like the two biggest sources of ressentiment, their sort of pool that they emerge from, they have specific objects. They don't arise without special reasons, and they're directed against definite objects. So often they don't outlast their motives. For example, he says, the desire for revenge disappears when vengeance has been taken, when the person against whom it was directed has been punished or has punished themselves, or when one truly forgives them. That's a possibility as well. In the same way, envy vanishes when the envied possession becomes ours. But what about the impulse to detract, to criticize, to disparage? That's something a little bit more global, right? He says that it's not in the same sense tied to definite objects. It does not arise through specific causes with which it disappears. On the contrary, this affect seeks those objects, and it tries to find gratification in those aspects of men and things. It likes to disparage, to smash pedestals, to dwell on the negative aspects of excellent men and things, exulting in the fact that such faults are more perceptible through their contrast with the strongly positive qualities. And Scheler calls this a fixed pattern of experience which can accommodate the most diverse contents. This form or structure fashions each concrete experience of life and selects it from positive experiences. So resentment, in this sense, is not just about being, resentful, having ressentiment towards this thing over here that originally made you feel bad. It becomes something pervasive, something global, something about one's entire orientation and attitude in life, right? Now, how does ressentiment arise? He's going to tell us that in order to have ressentiment, as opposed to just these negative emotions, which are stages in the development of its sources, we have to have something else happen. So he says revenge, envy, the impulse to detract, spite, Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is taking delight or literally joy in somebody else being damaged. Like you see somebody falling down and you're like, look at that jackass. You feel good because something bad happened to somebody else. Poetic justice, perhaps sometimes. All of these lead to ressentiment, he says, only if there occurs neither a moral self-conquest. Genuine forgiveness would be such a moral self-conquest. You are feeling resentful towards somebody, but you decide to forgive. And you're not just, making a fake forgiveness. You're actually forgiving them. You're letting it go. In the sort of biblical terminology, in the Gospels, it's afimi, to let something fly away, right? So if we don't have that, or we don't have an act or some other adequate expression of emotion, for example, verbal abuse, shaking one's fist, and so we don't have either of those, and if this restraint is caused by a pronounced awareness of impotence, a lack of power, a lack of capacity. So we've got two different things that have to go in there. We've got a negative affect and it's not adequately dealt with, and we also feel impotent in some way. So the emotions, he says, are strong, but they have to be suppressed because they're coupled with the feeling that one cannot act them out. Why not? Well, weakness, physical or mental, or fear. And so he says, in its very origin, ressentiment is chiefly confined to those who serve and are dominated at the moment, who fruitlessly resent the sting of authority. When it occurs elsewhere, could be because of psychological contagion, right? Or violent suppression of an impulse which revolts by embittering and poisoning the personality. So once again, we see that self-poisoning of the mind is taking place. So here's an example that he provides. If an ill-treated servant can vent his spleen in the antechamber, he can go outside and he can be like, that SOB treating me that way, who does he think he is, right? He's not going to get ressentiment. But if he's under surveillance, if he doesn't have a place where he can vent, as we say, then ressentiment can begin. And he's got this inner venom of ressentiment, right? He has to hide his feelings and keep his negative and hostile emotions to himself. That is where ressentiment festers and takes place. So, he talks about a couple different sources of ressentiment, which we're going to examine in greater detail in another place. Suffice it to say, impulses towards revenge and envy, those are some of the primary causes of it, although there's others as well. And then he makes a really interesting distinction here. He says, impulses of revenge lead to ressentiment the more they change into something else. What do they change into? Actual vindictiveness. So revenge is oriented against that person over there. Vindictiveness is, again, a more global attitude or motivation. Shifts towards indeterminate groups of objects which need only share one common characteristic. The less they're satisfied by vengeance taken on one specific object. If the desire for revenge remains permanently unsatisfied, and especially if the feeling of being right is intensified into the idea of a duty, the individual may actually wither and die, he says. And he's drawing on some anthropological discussions about conflicts to say that. And he says the vindictive person, now notice this is really important, is instinctively and without a conscious act of volition drawn towards events which may give rise to vengefulness. Or he tends to see injurious intentions and all kinds of perfectly innocent actions and remarks of others. Great touchiness is indeed frequently a symptom of a vengeful character. The vindictive person, Scheler says, is always in search of objects. They're always looking for some way, some object that they can be vindictive towards, because they already feel vindictive. They need, in order for it to rise to consciousness and have some agency, to actually find something that they can be vindictive towards. So, the vengeance restores their damaged feeling of personal value, but when that's repressed, vindictiveness leads to ressentiment, which is intensified when the imagination of vengeance too is repressed, and we get this tendency of detraction coming up. Right? So that's one common thing that happens. He also talks about envy, jealousy, and the competitive urge as being a major source of ressentiment. And he says envy, as the term is understood in everyday usage, is due to a feeling of impotence. We see that playing its role again, which we experience when another person owns a good that we covet. That person gets the job, we don't get the job. That person gets the accolades, the fame, we don't get it. We're nobody. That person gets the person who we desire to be with, and we don't get them. It could be anything that we're envious of. People can find almost any occasion for that. And he says, this tension between desire and non-fulfillment does not lead to envy unless it flares up in hatred against the owner. The person is falsely considered to be the cause of our privation. I don't have what I deserve because they took it, they've got it, and they're not letting me have it. Scheler's going to call this a causal delusion. They are the cause of my feeling deprived, right? No, they just happen to have something. You know, there wasn't any thing that they said, oh, I'm going to take this away from somebody else. I mean, if that's the case, then you actually have good reason to feel upset with them, but that's almost never the case, right? So he says that our factual inability to acquire a good is wrongly interpreted as a positive action against our desire, a delusion which diminishes the original tension. And so this shows you that envy is kind of connected to revenge, isn't it? We imagine that the other person has harmed us in some way by depriving us of what we deserve, and then we want to take revenge on them in a certain way, right? So that's coupled as well with this impotence to acquire what it is that we want. So these are ways in which ressentiment takes form. And notice that in all cases we have an impotence, we have a repression going on. We don't want to feel this way, so we conceal our actual feelings from ourselves. And where does this then lead to? So we saw him talking a little bit earlier about detracting from the other person's value. We want to pull them down. We want to say, yeah, they're not as good as they seem to be. People like them, but there's no reason why they actually care about them or like them. They're actually garbage. We can come up with a million examples of this sort of thing. So detracting from the other person's value. And then a little bit later, he's going to talk about something that we'll go into in great detail elsewhere, devaluation of values. Things that actually do have value. The person who has ressentiment is going to treat those things as if they don't have that value. They have a lower value. They devalue the values of things. Oh, I don't have an attractive partner. Attractiveness isn't really that important anyway. Only superficial people think that. Well, no, there's something there in physical attractiveness or spiritual attractiveness, right? I don't have a lot of money, but money can't buy you love. Well, no, nobody said that it would buy you love, but that's not all that you can do with money. That doesn't mean that money's no good, right? Oh, they think this person is so smart. Well, they're not so smart. Maybe they are so smart, but you just can't recognize it because you're devaluing the values of that. I don't have an education, but I'm street smart. I'm not like those academic ivory tower types. Right? You've heard this sort of stuff a lot of times. Academics don't live in ivory towers. That's a silly, imaginary thing that people say, often out of ressentiment, because they feel insecure, because they wish they could have that level of education, intelligence, the opportunity to learn, and they were deprived of it, and they think that somebody else screwed them over, The last thing I want to talk about here is he mentions social ressentiment, and this is an important feature. Earlier he also talked about contagion, so it's not just individual actions that can produce ressentiment. It's also the way our society is arranged. So he says that social ressentiment would be slight in a democracy which is not only political but also social and tends towards equality of property. Why? People are not going to be as envious of each other. They probably will be able to get redress when somebody does something wrong to them. He goes on, he says, the same would be the case and was the case in a caste society such as that of India, right, where you have this incredibly stratified, complex social arrangements, but everybody kind of knows their place, right? Or in a society with sharply divided classes. And so he says, if you want to find the strongest ressentiment, where do you look? A society like ours. Now, he's writing in Germany in the early 20th century, but we could think about late modern societies quite generally, at least in the West. So he says, approximately equal rights, political and otherwise, or formal social equality, publicly recognized, go hand in hand with wide, factual differences in power, property, and education. While each has the right to compare himself with everyone else, he cannot do so. In fact, quite independently of the characters and experiences of individuals, a potent charge of ressentiment is here accumulated by the very structure of society. So it's not just individual, it's also societal as well that plays a role in this dynamic of ressentiment. So that's an adequate characterization of ressentiment to get us started. Now we go through the text and delve into each of these important aspects a little bit more deeply in turn.